Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. In October 1965, 25-year-old newlywed Mary Shotwell Little went shopping at Atlanta's Lenox Square Mall and vanished into thin air. Her car was found the next day with traces of blood inside, her clothes neatly folded, and her keys missing. But the mystery deepens. Her credit cards were used hours later in North Carolina, with witnesses reporting seeing her with two unknown men, her face bruised and distressed. What happened to Mary that night? Was she the victim of a calculated abduction, or is there more to this story than meets the eye? Join me as we unravel one of Atlanta's most baffling cold cases. On the evening of October 14, 1965, Mary Shotwell Little left her job at the C&S Bank in downtown Atlanta, where she worked as a secretary. It was a typical Thursday, and the 25-year-old newlywed had plans to have dinner and do some shopping at Lenox Square, which was at the time a fairly new open-air shopping center in the affluent Buckhead area. What happened next would become one of Atlanta's most perplexing unsolved mysteries, one that continues to baffle investigators to this day. Mary was known to her friends and family as a responsible, level-headed young woman. She had married Roy Little Jr. just 6 weeks earlier, on September 1st, and the couple had settled into a happy routine in their apartment near Emory University. Roy was away on a business trip to LaGrange, Georgia, about 65 miles southwest of Atlanta. But Mary wasn't the type to let that stop her from going about her normal activities. That evening, Mary met her friend and co-worker Linda Darnell at the S&S cafeteria in Lenox Square. They had dinner together, chatting about work and life, with Mary showing no signs of distress or concern. After their meal, around 6:30 p.m., the two friends parted ways. Mary planned to do some grocery shopping at Colonial Stores and perhaps browse at Rich's department store, both located within the shopping center. Multiple witnesses would later confirm seeing Mary shopping at the Colonial store that evening. She purchased several items, including groceries and cat food for her pet. The last confirmed sighting of Mary was around 8 p.m. by store employees. What happened after that remains one of the most mysterious aspects of this case. The next morning, Friday, October 15th, Mary failed to show up for work at C&S Bank. This was completely out of character for her, as she was known for her punctuality and reliability. Her supervisor became concerned and contacted Roy Little, who had returned from his business trip. When Roy arrived at Lenox Square, he made a disturbing discovery that would launch one of Atlanta's most intensive missing persons investigations. Mary's 1965 Mercury Comet was found parked in almost exactly the same spot where she had left it the previous evening. But something was terribly wrong. The car was locked, but inside, investigators found Mary's undergarments neatly folded and placed in a shopping bag. Her keys were missing. Most disturbing of all, there were traces of blood found on both the car's steering wheel and the interior of the vehicle. The investigation revealed more puzzling details. Mary's clothing from the previous day was discovered in the car, suggesting she had changed clothes at some point. Yet there was no sign of struggle in or around the vehicle. The blood found in the car was determined to be type O, the same as Mary's, but the amount was minimal, not indicating a serious injury. Perhaps the most baffling aspect of the case emerged when investigators checked Mary's credit card activity. Her Gulf Oil credit card had been used multiple times in the early morning hours of October 15th at gas stations in Charlotte and Raleigh, North Carolina. Both charge slips bore what appeared to be Mary's signature, and witnesses at both locations reported seeing a woman matching Mary's description. Even more strange, these witnesses said the woman appeared to be in distress and had visible facial injuries. She was reportedly accompanied by two men. The timeline made little sense. The distance between Atlanta and Charlotte is approximately 245 miles, and Raleigh is even further. For Mary's credit card to have been used in these locations in the early morning hours, someone would have had to drive through the night at considerable speed. Additionally, if Mary had been abducted, why would her captors risk being seen at gas stations, allowing her to sign credit card slips? The investigation expanded rapidly. The FBI became involved, and agents interviewed hundreds of people. They scrutinized Mary's background, her relationships, and her activities in the days leading up to her disappearance. What they found only added to the mystery. In the weeks before her disappearance, Mary had mentioned to several friends that she felt she was being followed. She told her supervisor at the bank that she had received some strange phone calls at work. However, she didn't seem particularly alarmed by these incidents and hadn't reported them to the police. Investigators also learned that on the day before her disappearance, Mary had withdrawn a significant amount of money from her bank account. She had also visited a doctor for a checkup, though the reason for this visit was never clearly established. These actions could be seen as preparation for something, but what exactly remained unclear. The police explored numerous theories. Was this a random abduction? A planned kidnapping? Had Mary arranged her own disappearance? The evidence seemed to point in multiple directions, and each theory had its problems. If this was a random attack, why were there no signs of struggle? If Mary had planned to disappear, why leave behind such a disturbing scene in her car? And what about those credit card charges in North Carolina? The investigation would reveal another strange detail. In the days following Mary's disappearance, several of her friends and co-workers received anonymous phone calls. The caller, described as a male with a deep voice, would simply say, "Mary isn't dead, she's alive," before hanging up. The calls were never traced, and their significance remains unknown to this day. Roy Little was thoroughly investigated, but was quickly cleared as a suspect. He had a solid alibi for the night of Mary's disappearance, and all evidence indicated that the newlyweds had a happy marriage. In fact, they had been planning to start a family, and Mary had recently told friends how excited she was about their future together. The case garnered extensive media coverage in Atlanta and throughout the Southeast. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution ran daily updates on the investigation, and local television stations featured regular reports about the search for Mary. The public was captivated by the mysterious disappearance of this young woman who seemed to have everything to live for. As weeks turned into months, the leads began to dry up. Despite the efforts of the Atlanta Police Department, the FBI and private investigators hired by Mary's family, no concrete evidence emerged to explain what had happened to Mary Shotwell Little on that October night in 1965. The investigation took another intriguing turn when detectives began to look more closely at Mary's activities in the months leading up to her disappearance. Several of her co-workers at C&S Bank came forward with information that painted a picture of subtle but noticeable changes in Mary's behavior. While she maintained her professional demeanor, some noticed she had become more reserved in the weeks before she vanished. One particularly significant lead emerged when investigators interviewed Mary's hairdresser, who reported a concerning conversation from early October. During her last appointment, Mary had mentioned feeling uneasy about a man who seemed to be watching her during her lunch breaks. She described him as well-dressed, but couldn't provide many specific details about his appearance. The hairdresser recalled that Mary had brushed off her own concerns, attributing them to newlywed jitters. The investigation also revealed that Mary had made several unusual phone calls from her work phone in the weeks before her disappearance. Phone records showed calls to numbers that investigators were never able to trace or connect to anyone in Mary's known circle of friends and associates. When questioned about these calls, her co-workers remembered Mary taking them in hushed tones and appearing somewhat agitated afterward. Another compelling piece of evidence came from a night watchman at Lenox Square who had been working the evening of October 14th. In his initial statement to police, he reported seeing a woman matching Mary's description walking to her car around 8:30 p.m. However, what made his testimony particularly interesting was his observation of two men lingering near the parking lot's entrance. The watchman noted that the men seemed out of place, as most stores were closing for the evening, yet they weren't heading to any vehicles. The credit card signatures from Charlotte and Raleigh became a focal point of the investigation. Handwriting experts from the FBI conducted detailed analyses of the signatures. Their findings were inconclusive. While the signatures bore similarities to Mary's known handwriting, there were subtle differences that couldn't be explained. This led to speculation that she might have been forced to sign the slips under duress. The gas station attendants who witnessed the North Carolina stops provided more detailed descriptions to investigators. The attendant in Charlotte described the woman as wearing a dark coat and appearing disoriented. He noted that her face appeared to be bruised, and she kept her head down while one of the men did most of the talking. The Raleigh attendant's account was similar, adding that the woman seemed to be crying and that one of the men had his hand firmly gripped on her arm. The description of the two men was frustratingly vague. Both were described as white males in their 30s or 40s, of average height and build, wearing dark clothing. One witness noted that they drove a dark-colored car, possibly a Chevrolet, but couldn't be more specific. The lack of detailed descriptions was particularly frustrating for investigators, as this was potentially the last known sighting of Mary alive. In December 1965, 2 months after Mary's disappearance, police received an anonymous letter that claimed to know what had happened to her. The letter, postmarked from Augusta, Georgia, contained details about the case that hadn't been released to the public. The writer claimed that Mary had been targeted by a group of men who had been watching her for weeks before the abduction. However, despite extensive investigation, the letter's author was never identified, and the leads it provided led nowhere. The investigation also explored Mary's connection to her workplace, the C&S Bank. As a secretary in the loan department, she had access to sensitive financial information. Investigators considered whether her disappearance might have been connected to bank-related activities, but no evidence ever emerged to support this theory. Her supervisors described her as a model employee who never showed any signs of being involved in anything suspicious or illegal. Roy Little, Mary's husband, continued to cooperate fully with investigators throughout the investigation. He provided detailed information about their relationship, their future plans, and Mary's state of mind in the weeks before her disappearance. According to Roy, they had been planning to start a family and had recently discussed buying a house. He emphasized that Mary was excited about their future together and had no reason to want to disappear voluntarily. The investigation also revealed that Mary had visited her gynecologist the day before her disappearance. The doctor confirmed that it was a routine checkup and that Mary had appeared to be in good spirits. However, the timing of this visit, combined with her withdrawal of money from her bank account, led some investigators to speculate about whether Mary might have been pregnant. This theory was never confirmed, and medical records from the visit showed no indication of pregnancy. One of the more puzzling aspects of the case was the state in which Mary's car was found. Forensic experts meticulously examined the vehicle but found no signs of forced entry. The blood spots were small and scattered, suggesting they might have resulted from minor injuries rather than a violent struggle. The neat folding of Mary's undergarments and the careful placement of her belongings seemed at odds with a violent abduction scenario. The investigation also looked into Mary's social circle beyond her immediate family and co-workers. They discovered that she had been involved in a church group and regularly attended social functions with other young couples. None of these connections yielded any significant leads, but they did provide additional confirmation of Mary's character as a well-liked, socially active young woman with no known enemies. The investigation took another significant turn when detectives began exploring a possible connection between Mary's disappearance and other unsolved cases in the Southeast. Of particular interest was the case of Diane Shields, another young woman who had worked at C&S Bank, who was murdered in East Point, Georgia in 1967. Like Mary, Shields had been a secretary at the bank, though she started working there after Mary's disappearance. The similarities between the cases were striking enough to warrant further investigation. Investigators also delved deeper into the strange phone calls that Mary's friends and co-workers received after her disappearance. One of her closest friends at the bank reported receiving 3 such calls within a 2-week period. Each time, the male caller would make the same statement about Mary being alive, but in one call, he added the cryptic message, "She's in good hands." Voice analysis technology at the time was primitive, but witnesses consistently described the caller as having a deep, possibly disguised voice, with what some thought was a slight southern accent. The search expanded to include several wooded areas along the route between Atlanta and Charlotte, based on the theory that Mary might have been transported along this corridor. Law enforcement organized several large-scale searches involving both police officers and volunteers. These searches uncovered various items of interest, including a woman's shoe that matched the style Mary was known to wear, but forensic analysis couldn't definitively link any of these items to her case. Another aspect that troubled investigators was the timing of events on the night of October 14th. The shopping center's security logs showed that most businesses had closed by 9 p.m., yet Mary's car remained in the parking lot overnight. This meant that whatever happened to Mary likely occurred during a relatively quiet period when few people would have been around to witness anything suspicious. In early 1966, investigators received an intriguing lead from a truck driver who regularly traveled between Atlanta and Charlotte. He reported picking up a male hitchhiker in late October 1965 who had made disturbing comments about a girl who disappeared in Atlanta. When the driver mentioned Mary Shotwell Little's case, the hitchhiker became agitated and asked to be let out of the truck. Despite an extensive search, this mysterious hitchhiker was never identified. The FBI's involvement in the case brought additional resources and expertise, including the use of their new computerized record-keeping system. Agents cross-referenced Mary's case with other unsolved disappearances and murders throughout the Southeast, looking for patterns or similarities that might provide new leads. While several cases shared some characteristics with Mary's disappearance, none provided the breakthrough investigators hoped for. One of the more controversial aspects of the investigation involved Mary's personal diary, which was found in her apartment. While most entries were mundane descriptions of daily activities, there were several cryptic references to someone Mary referred to only as H. These entries began appearing about 2 months before her disappearance, but investigators were never able to determine who H might have been. Roy Little insisted he had no knowledge of anyone in Mary's life whose name began with that letter. The investigation also revealed that Mary had changed her routine slightly in the weeks before her disappearance. She had begun taking a different route to work, though she never explained why to any of her co-workers. She had also started carrying a small can of pepper spray in her purse, which her friend Linda Darnell said was unusual for Mary, who had never expressed serious concerns about her safety before. Law enforcement officials were particularly frustrated by the credit card trail in North Carolina. The timing of the charges suggested that whoever was traveling with Mary, or using her credit card, was driving at high speeds through the night. Traffic records from that evening showed no reports of speeding vehicles along the likely route, despite the fact that maintaining such a schedule would have required traveling well above the speed limit. The case took another strange turn when investigators discovered that someone had attempted to access Mary's bank account approximately 2 weeks after her disappearance. The attempt was made at a different C&S branch, and the teller reported that a woman claiming to be Mary had tried to withdraw funds but fled when asked for identification. Despite the bank's security cameras, the image quality was too poor to make a positive identification. One theory that gained traction among some investigators was that Mary's disappearance might have been connected to organized crime. Atlanta in the mid-1960s was experiencing significant growth and change, and with it came an increase in organized criminal activity. However, no concrete evidence ever emerged to support this theory, and Mary had no known connections to any criminal elements. The investigation also explored Mary's activities at work more thoroughly, particularly focusing on her role in the loan department. As a secretary, she had access to sensitive financial information and was involved in processing loan applications. Investigators interviewed dozens of loan applicants who had been denied in the months leading up to her disappearance, thinking perhaps someone might have harbored a grudge. But this line of inquiry ultimately led nowhere. As the investigation continued into 1966, detectives began receiving reports of possible sightings of Mary across the southeastern United States. One particularly compelling account came from a waitress at a diner in South Carolina who claimed to have served a woman matching Mary's description in February 1966. The woman appeared nervous and was accompanied by a man who did most of the talking. While investigators followed up on this lead, like many others, it ultimately proved inconclusive. The case also drew attention from several private investigators, including one hired by Mary's parents. This investigator developed an interesting theory about the blood found in Mary's car. He suggested that the small amount and distribution pattern might indicate that someone had deliberately placed it there to mislead investigators. However, forensic analysis at the time wasn't sophisticated enough to determine the age of the blood samples or whether they had been deliberately planted. Another significant development came when investigators discovered that several other young women in the Atlanta area had reported being followed in the Lenox Square area during the months leading up to Mary's disappearance. None of these incidents had been reported to police at the time, but came to light only after Mary's case made headlines. Two of these women provided similar descriptions of a well-dressed man in his 40s who would appear to be shopping, but would follow them to their cars. The investigation also uncovered an unusual pattern of phone calls made to Mary's apartment in the weeks before her disappearance. Phone records showed several calls from public phone booths in the Atlanta area, all made during working hours when Mary would typically have been at the bank. When questioned, her neighbors recalled hearing her phone ringing frequently, but assumed she had an active social life due to her recent marriage. In late 1966, investigators received what seemed to be a promising lead when a former gas station attendant from Tennessee came forward with information. He claimed that on the morning of October 15, 1965, he had seen a woman he believed to be Mary at his station near Knoxville. According to his account, she appeared distressed and was traveling with two men in a dark sedan. While this sighting would fit the general timeline of Mary's movement north, investigators couldn't definitively confirm or dismiss this account. The case took another interesting turn when police began investigating possible connections between Mary's disappearance and a series of bank-related crimes in the Southeast. Several banks had reported incidents of fraud involving female employees during this period. While no direct connection to Mary's case was ever established, the pattern suggested the possibility of an organized group targeting bank employees. Roy Little continued to search for answers about his wife's disappearance, even as the official investigation began to slow down. He maintained regular contact with law enforcement and hired additional private investigators over the years. In interviews, he often spoke about the difficulty of not knowing what happened to Mary, describing it as a nightmare without end. The investigation also revealed more details about Mary's last day at work. Several co-workers reported that she had received a phone call around lunchtime that seemed to upset her, though she didn't discuss it with anyone. Her desk calendar showed an appointment marked only with an X for the following week, but no one knew what this referred to. As the months turned into years, the case remained active, but leads became increasingly scarce. The FBI maintained a file on the case, periodically reviewing it when new forensic techniques became available. However, the limited physical evidence collected in 1965 provided few opportunities for modern analysis. The case also sparked changes in security procedures at Atlanta area shopping centers. Lenox Square, in particular, implemented new parking lot patrol patterns and installed better lighting. These changes came too late for Mary, but they represented a growing awareness of the need for better security in public spaces. One of the most haunting aspects of the case was the impact it had on Atlanta's collective psyche. The disappearance of a young professional woman from a busy shopping center challenged the city's sense of security and reminded residents that danger could lurk in even the most ordinary places. The case became a cautionary tale, passed down through generations of Atlanta families. Despite thousands of investigative hours, hundreds of interviews, and numerous theories, the fundamental questions about Mary Shotwell Little's disappearance remain unanswered. What happened in that parking lot on October 14, 1965? Who were the two men seen with her in North Carolina? And perhaps most importantly, what became of Mary herself? The case of Mary Shotwell Little had a profound impact on Atlanta's law enforcement procedures and public safety measures. In the years following her disappearance, the Atlanta Police Department established new protocols for handling missing persons cases, particularly those involving potential abductions. The case also led to increased cooperation between different law enforcement agencies across state lines, as the multi-state nature of the investigation had highlighted some of the challenges in coordinating such efforts. One of the more disturbing theories that emerged in the later stages of the investigation involved the possibility of a serial predator operating in the Southeast during this period. Investigators identified several cases between 1965 and 1970 involving young professional women who disappeared under similar circumstances, though no definitive links were ever established with Mary's case. Mary's family never gave up hope of finding answers. Her parents, who passed away in the 1980s, spent considerable resources continuing private investigations into their daughter's disappearance. They established a reward fund for information leading to the resolution of the case, which grew to over $20,000 through contributions from family, friends, and concerned citizens. The C&S Bank, where Mary worked, also played a significant role in keeping the case alive. The bank maintained her employee file as active for several years after her disappearance, and several of her former colleagues continued to pursue leads independently. The bank's security department cooperated fully with ongoing investigations, providing access to records and personnel whenever new leads emerged. In the 1970s, investigators attempted to use new forensic techniques to re-examine the blood evidence from Mary's car. While these tests provided more detailed information about the blood type and characteristics, they couldn't definitively prove whether the blood had been planted or shed during a struggle. The car itself had been returned to Roy Little years earlier, making further forensic examination impossible. The credit card charges in North Carolina remained one of the most puzzling aspects of the case. Banking records showed that Mary's credit card was never used again after the charges in Charlotte and Raleigh. This pattern was unusual for kidnapping cases, where perpetrators often continue to use victims' credit cards until the accounts are frozen. This detail led some investigators to speculate that the North Carolina sightings might have been Mary's last known movements. The case files reveal that investigators spent considerable time exploring Mary's activities in the months before her marriage to Roy Little. They discovered that she had briefly dated another man earlier in 1965, but this relationship had ended amicably several months before she met Roy. The former boyfriend was interviewed multiple times and had a solid alibi for the night of Mary's disappearance. One of the more intriguing theories developed by investigators involved the possibility that Mary had uncovered something suspicious during her work at the bank. As a secretary in the loan department, she had access to sensitive financial information and processed numerous loan applications. Some investigators believed she might have inadvertently discovered evidence of financial fraud or other criminal activity, though no evidence was ever found to support this theory. The case remains one of Atlanta's most enduring mysteries. It represents not just the tragedy of a young woman's disappearance, but also marks a turning point in how the city viewed public safety and security. The case file remains open, and periodically, new investigators review the evidence, hoping that advancing technology or new information might finally provide answers to what happened to Mary Shotwell Little on that October night in 1965. To this day, no trace of Mary has ever been found. No body was ever recovered, and no definitive evidence emerged to explain her fate. The case stands as a haunting reminder of how a person can seemingly vanish without a trace, even from a busy public place, leaving behind only questions and theories about what might have happened.